You show a man-to-man coverage, he'll make the throw.
Okay.
Zone coverage, though?
Yeah. But that's typically harder, I think, the zones like for quarterbacks. I'm going to say they made a bad decision. They should have got Shedeur Sanders.
He should be pushing for leverage. Yep.
Excellent.
If I said gun, diesel right, 56, F my canner, who's running the shallow?
The F.
Who's running the curl?
The X.
Running the post?
The Z.
Who's running the middle?
The Y.
Good. All right. Let's play one more game.
The closer we got to the draft, the stronger I felt about it. That at first I said that this was in January, February. I was like, I'm starting to think the gap between Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders is bigger than the gap between Shedeur Sanders and the pack. It's clear as day. They prefer Jackson Dart. And I'm not even talking about Cam Ward now. So this idea, half of me thinks it's not fair to Shedeur.
And Shedeur apparently didn't take to it well. And at one point, one of the few teams that actually was interested in him said, well, what do you make of this really bad play? And Shedeur said, maybe I'm not the guy for you. That's not the answer. Since there were only 3 or 4 teams in the first round that were going to consider it, now that Pittsburgh apparently has a deal with Aaron Rodgers, so take them out. Despite the fact that Shedeur Sanders had the fewest attempts, he was the most efficient and most productive with the fewest reps. So the quarterback tracker for those radio audience members, Flacco was 9 for 14 and a touchdown. Pickett, 9 for 16, no touchdown. Dylan Gabriel, 11 of 16, 2 touchdowns and a pick. And Sanders, 7 of 9, 3 touchdowns, no picks. This, Justin, I've seen enough. I'm calling it a wrap. The Herd newsroom is calling it in Ohio.
Or it was about going and finding a fit somewhere. And there was no one who saw it that way. And I wrote it, I said it until I was blue in the face. And the closer we got to the draft, the stronger I felt about it. That at first I said that this was in January, February. I was like, I'm starting to think the gap between Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders is bigger than the gap between...
What if I told you that the New York Giants just accidentally exposed the biggest draft conspiracy in NFL history? Secret interview footage has leaked, and what it reveals about Shedeur Sanders will completely change how you view the 2024 draft process. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the media narrative around Sanders was completely fabricated and why one of the most respected analysts just called the Giants' decision the biggest mistake in franchise history. I've been covering draft controversies for years, but nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what we're about to uncover. The Shedeur Sanders draft controversy isn't just back, it's exploded into something that's shaking the entire NFL establishment to its core. For months, we've been fed a narrative that Sanders was problematic, difficult, and somehow inferior to quarterbacks like Jackson Dart and Cam Ward. But here's what the league doesn't want you to know. Leaked footage from the Giants' war room tells a completely different story. Today, I'm going to walk you through 3 explosive revelations that prove Sanders was the victim of the most coordinated character assassination in modern draft history. First, we'll examine the statistical evidence that media analysts deliberately ignored. Then, I'll show you the leaked footage that exposes what really happened in that infamous Giants interview. Finally, we'll reveal why prominent critics who destroyed Sanders' reputation are now desperately trying to rewrite history. This isn't just about one player, this is about how narratives are manufactured to destroy careers before they even begin. Here's something that will make your blood boil. While analysts were busy tearing down Shedeur Sanders' character, they completely ignored statistical evidence that proved he was the superior quarterback all along. Let me paint you a picture of what really happened. When Albert Breer claimed Sanders was significantly behind Jackson Dart and Cam Ward, he wasn't looking at the numbers, he was pushing a narrative. But the statistics don't lie, and what they reveal is absolutely damning for every analyst who participated in this character assassination. Sanders finished with a 74% completion percentage. Think about that for a moment, 74%. That's not just good, That's elite-level accuracy that puts him in the same conversation as the most precise quarterbacks in college football history. Meanwhile, Jackson Dart, the supposed superior prospect, managed only 69.3%. Cam Ward? Even worse at 67.2%. We're talking about a 5 to 7% gap in completion percentage, which in quarterback terms is the difference between a franchise player and a backup. But here's where it gets really interesting and infuriating. When you dig deeper into the touchdown numbers, Sanders threw 37 touchdowns, just 2 behind Ward's 39, while Dart managed only 29. So let me get this straight. Sanders was more accurate, nearly as productive in the red zone, and yet somehow he was the problem child of the draft class. The media's selective amnesia becomes even more obvious when you consider the pressure situations. Sanders led Colorado through some of the most high-profile, high-pressure games in college football. He didn't just survive under that microscope, he thrived. His poise in clutch moments was legendary, yet analysts chose to focus on manufactured personality concerns instead of his proven ability to perform when everything was on the line. What's truly shocking is how coordinated this statistical cover-up was. Major networks, prominent analysts, and draft experts all seem to collectively ignore these numbers. It's as if there was an unspoken agreement to focus on everything except Sanders' actual performance on the field. They talked about his attitude, his family's demands, his supposed interview problems, anything to avoid discussing the fact that he was statistically superior to the quarterbacks they were promoting. The most damning evidence? When Colin Cowherd, one of Sanders' harshest critics, finally watched him perform in OTAs, he couldn't ignore what was right in front of him. Sanders went 7 for 9 with 3 touchdowns and no interceptions, outperforming both veteran Joe Flacco and rookie Dylan Gabriel. Suddenly, Cowherd was calling him one of the best quarterbacks on the roster and suggesting he should start immediately. This statistical evidence wasn't hidden in some obscure database, it was public information that every analyst had access to. The fact that they chose to ignore it while manufacturing controversy around Sanders' personality reveals something much darker about how draft narratives are created and manipulated. The question isn't whether Sanders had the numbers to be the top quarterback in the draft. He clearly did. The question is why an entire industry conspired to hide that truth from the public. Now we get to the smoking gun that exposes this entire conspiracy, the leaked interview footage that the Giants never wanted you to see. What I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you thought you knew about Shedeur Sanders and the 2024 draft process. Remember Colin Cowherd's dramatic claim that Sanders had the worst interview he'd ever seen? According to Cowherd, when the Giants showed Sanders film of bad plays and asked him to analyze them, Sanders supposedly said, "Maybe I'm not the guy for you." This story spread like wildfire, becoming the foundation for every negative narrative about Sanders' character and professionalism. But here's what really happened. According to Albert Breer's investigation, the Giants didn't just show Sanders random bad plays, they showed him a compilation of mistakes and asked him to identify what went wrong. The catch? Sanders couldn't find the mistakes because they were so subtle or contextual that even experienced coaches might miss them. When Sanders struggled to identify these deliberately obscure errors, he became frustrated, not arrogant, not dismissive, but frustrated like any competitor would be when faced with an impossible task. Think about this scenario for a moment. You're a top quarterback prospect. You've dominated college football, and you're sitting in an interview where team executives are essentially setting you up to fail with trick questions. When you can't immediately spot mistakes that require insider knowledge to identify, they use your honest frustration as evidence that you're difficult or not coachable. But here's the truly explosive part. If this interview was so damaging to Sanders, why hasn't the Giants released the footage? They leaked Jackson Dart's interview, which was described as awkward and disappointing. They've made other interview footage available to media members. Yet Sanders' interview remains locked away like it's classified information. The answer is obvious. The footage would completely destroy the narrative they've spent months building. If Sanders really said, "Maybe I'm not the guy for you," in the arrogant, dismissive way Cowherd described, the Giants would have released that footage immediately. It would have been the perfect justification for passing on him. The fact that they're keeping it secret tells us everything we need to know. What's even more revealing is how the story has evolved. Initially, sources claimed Sanders was unprepared and showed poor football IQ. Then it became about his attitude and family demands. Now we're learning it was actually about his inability to identify deliberately obscure mistakes in game film. Each version of the story contradicts the last, which is exactly what happens when people are trying to cover up the truth. The leaked footage controversy also raises serious questions about the Giants' evaluation process. If they're using trick questions and impossible scenarios to evaluate quarterbacks, what does that say about their ability to identify talent? Maybe the problem isn't with Sanders. Maybe it's with an organization that would rather play gotcha games than evaluate actual football ability. The most damning evidence is the timing. As more details about the real interview process emerge, Sanders' stock keeps rising while the Giants' credibility keeps falling. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when the truth finally comes to light. Here's where this story gets absolutely wild. The same media personalities who spent months destroying Shedeur Sanders' reputation are now desperately trying to rewrite history, and their about-face is so dramatic it's almost comical, if it weren't so damaging to a young man's career. Colin Cowherd, the man who called Sanders' interview the worst he'd ever seen, just delivered one of the most embarrassing reversals in sports media history. After watching Sanders throw 7 for 9 with 3 touchdowns in OTAs, Cowherd suddenly declared him one of the best quarterbacks on the roster and suggested he should start over veteran Joe Flacco. Let me repeat that. The same analyst who claimed Sanders was unprofessional and unprepared is now calling for him to be the starter after seeing him throw 9 passes in practice. But Cowherd isn't alone in this desperate damage control. Stephen A. Smith, who amplified every negative story about Sanders, is now praising his natural leadership and elite arm talent. Analysts who question his football IQ are suddenly marveling at his quick processing and advanced reads. It's like watching people pretend they never said what we all heard them say just months ago. The most telling example is how they're now framing the Jackson-Dart comparison. Remember when Dart was supposedly the more NFL-ready prospect with better fundamentals? Now that Sanders is outperforming expectations while Dart struggles, these same analysts are quietly shifting their language. Suddenly, Sanders has always had the higher ceiling and was undervalued due to circumstances beyond his control. This revisionist history isn't just embarrassing, it's revealing. It shows that these analysts never actually believed their own negative assessments of Sanders. If they truly thought he was problematic, unprepared, or inferior to other quarterbacks, they wouldn't be so quick to praise him now. Their rapid reversal proves they were either completely wrong in their evaluation or deliberately misleading their audiences. What's particularly infuriating is how they're trying to memory hold their previous coverage. Cowherd isn't acknowledging that he was wrong about Sanders' character, he's acting like he always saw the potential. Smith isn't apologizing for amplifying false narratives, he's pretending he was always a Sanders supporter. They're hoping their audiences won't remember the months of negative coverage they provided. The most damning evidence of this media manipulation is the timing. Sanders' abilities didn't suddenly improve overnight. His completion percentage was always 74%. His touchdown production was always elite. His leadership was always evident to anyone who watched Colorado play. The only thing that changed was the narrative these analysts were willing to promote. This pattern reveals something deeply troubling about sports media, the willingness to destroy a young athlete's reputation based on rumors, speculation, and manufactured controversy, then quietly reverse course when the truth becomes undeniable. Sanders didn't change. The media's willingness to tell the truth about him changed. The question every viewer should be asking is, if these analysts were so wrong about Sanders, what else are they wrong about? And more importantly, How many other talented athletes have had their careers damaged by similar character assassinations disguised as analysis? The Shedeur Sanders controversy isn't just about one quarterback or one draft. It's about how narratives are manufactured to destroy careers and manipulate public opinion. We've seen the statistical evidence that was ignored, the interview footage that was misrepresented, and the desperate attempts to rewrite history when the truth became undeniable. Sanders' journey from problematic prospect to franchise quarterback didn't happen because he suddenly improved. It happened because the truth finally overcame the manufactured narrative. His 74% completion percentage, his 37 touchdowns, his leadership under pressure, none of that changed. What changed was the media's willingness to acknowledge what was always there. The real lesson here isn't about Sanders, it's about the power of narrative over truth, and how quickly that narrative can crumble when confronted with reality. What do you think about this entire controversy? Was Shedeur Sanders the victim of a coordinated character assassination, or were there legitimate concerns about his draft stock? More importantly, how much should we trust analysts who can completely reverse their opinions overnight? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to see more exposés of how draft narratives are manufactured, make sure you're subscribed because I've got some explosive content coming next week about how this same pattern has affected other top prospects.